Welcome to Windows on the World. Very interesting show for you tonight, and I'm looking forward to doing more on the Shattered Isles project. First of all, a few things I have to talk about. Of course, the themes of our shows link together. Some follow on from others, some stand as individual pockets of information, and many interlink with a long established archive, a very large archive we have at Windows on the World. Now, the platform which hosts our Sunday shows and more, Spreaker, has recently disabled downloads. This is an enormous inconvenience, and I will be moving our archive onto another platform. In the meantime, please use Podbean, which has our entire archive of 383 shows. The link to Podbean is on both the homepage and the live shows page at windowsontheworld.net. That's Podbean, the podcasting platform. So Spreaker have also announced that they're going to be stopping live broadcasts by the end of the year, so they're about as much use as a chocolate fireguard. And I can't believe that a podcasting company would actually disable downloads. So they're going into freefall. And it's really annoying because the cost of all this stuff has gone up tremendously, and they're not even doing the job that we're paying them for. So remember that the link to Podbean, where you can download all of our shows, is on both the homepage and the live shows page, where we broadcast onto at windowsontheworld.net. I have talked about the possible alternatives and future of this particular information stream before. The costs in finding a new host for the archive and carrying on in the present way are now very expensive, but I'm very grateful to the people who are loyal to the show and either make small donations or have a regular payment, like the £5 a month club, which I suggested, where people pay it directly into my bank account without it going into PayPal, because PayPal take a lot of commission. It's very convenient, but they take a lot of commission, and none of us know how long we're going to be on these platforms in the future or be able to be allowed to use them. Also, of course, we've got a Patreon account. Now, if you want to support our work, please do it, because I'm making more video content at the moment, which will be available to people who do support the show first. And I'm offering the whole of our archive for nothing. And by the end of this year, I will have to broadcast on a subscription-only basis unless more listeners start to actually help out. £5 a month, what is it? Nothing. Well, it might be something to you, but really, for the amount of information that we put out, I think it's a pretty good deal. Now, the thing is that I won't be able to carry on doing this. And also, I found out that the whole of what's called alternative media is now a complete waste of time. I can't think of anything that is any use about it. When I go onto these shows, which I do occasionally, I find them so far behind the curve, it's almost a waste of time, and usually it is a waste of time. So I found that the audience that we have is a very unique audience, and I'm very glad that we've got you out there, because the audience that listens to this show are a cut above those who are listening to the garbage. And I'm not being elitist here. Well, I suppose I'm allowed to be, really, aren't I? I've been doing it long enough. But I'd just like to thank the people who do support me, because they've always supported this show. But we just need a few more, and it's not that many. It's not really many people. I mean, I can do this pretty cheaply, and the only thing, of course, is the cost of the broadcasting platforms are going up, because I use StreamYard and Spreaker, and there's lots of other expenses that I have to pay, really, that are associated with it. When I added it all up, I thought, yeah, as usual, you're working for basically nothing. But I don't mind that as long as some of the bills are getting paid. But that's the end of that particular lecture or statement. I think more of a statement than a lecture, dear listener, because I don't like to go on about the situation too much, because we've got so much other stuff to cover. And I do want to keep people who are keen to hear this information on board, because I think it's great. I think this show has a really good community in the real sense of the word, because our Discord group has got some great people. They're constantly suggesting things and they really help me with the research, and I'm hoping that I help them with their research. That's what it's all about. It's a lifelong research project which I'm sharing. So it's not just a podcast. And I think that's the important thing here, because the backlog of our shows contains such important information. That's why I want to have to migrate it. And to migrate it is going to be really expensive, because there's 383 episodes at the moment. So to get it onto another platform, I'm going to have to start paying a very high rate to start with, because everything's gone up. So yes, do support the show, and I'll get on with it now. Now, history depends on the authenticity of its artifacts and documents. We have to remember that if something isn't a proven fake, then it is unquestioned by academia. The stories we are told are accepted first, of course, by the academic world and its authorities, then, of course, unquestioningly by most of us. As most who listen to this show will know, recent history and the official stories for who, why and where are unconvincing, to say the least. We've talked about the rewriting of history much in our shows about Britain's lost past. We accept long-term history, which depends on linking a series of incidents or even alleged incidents together as a story. This is what most people do. They just accept the story. But I found in my history lessons, you probably did too, when we were at school, that a lot of the stuff we were taught was lacking in credible explanations as to why it happened, and teachers were just stating things did happen. And I found it very fragmented, the teaching of history at school, which is incredible really, because I'm so interested in history that it was done in such a way in school that it made it completely and utterly incomprehensibly boring. That's the teacher's fault, I suppose. But if it doesn't make sense, then it's probably a cover story. Well, talking of recent times, I remember attending a trial where Anthony John Hill, aka Muad'Dib, had sent his film 7/7 Ripple Effect, which was about the 7/7 London bombings, to Kingston Crown Court. And the trial was not for the 7/7 bombers, who were meant to have suicided themselves with bombs, when in fact 3 of them had been shot in Canary Wharf. There was even a plaque to say so. The 4th bomber was not even there on the day, to fill you in. Really, it was about people who were associated with these bombers. And one trial, I think, had already collapsed, and they were just trying to get somebody to pin this on. In other words, accomplices. But the photoshopped picture, which had put the 4 at the scene, was so badly photoshopped, it must have been a cry for help from inside the UK government. A safety railing was pictured going in front of one of Khan, who was the 4th bomber. It was in front of him, his body, when he was actually in front of this rail, but the rail appeared to be going through in front of his body. So in other words, he was standing against something. Say he's standing against a wall. Well, the wall was superimposed in front of him. I mean, it was that bad. And this was shown in plain sight on every TV in the country, on every news show in the world, yet no one said a thing. Well, we did in our 7/7 Revisited series. It was an obvious and very bad Photoshop forgery. It was the first point brought up in our series 7/7 Revisited. The whole scenario of the bombers entering Luton Station was also covered in the first minute of that series. There was no picture of them from the camera inside the door of the station, and no footage of them on the underground due to the Israeli company Verint stating they had not got the footage. And interestingly, Annie Machon, the ex-MI5 employee agent, brought up another incident. A car bomb in 1994 set off outside the Israeli embassy was believed by a senior officer of MI5 to be a Mossad operation. The UK government and MI5 would not promise more security at the embassy, however, as there was no plausible reason for them to do so. So, they simply set off a car bomb and framed 2 Palestinian student activists. The Palestinians were both jailed and got 20-year sentences, and they're still in jail now. The car had been obtained by a middleman who sold one of the students the car, which was used in the explosion. Of course, the car salesman disappeared and was believed by MI5 to have been a Mossad agent. The Crown, however, acted in the interests of their number one ally and framed two innocents. With this pattern in mind, we can look at recent events such as the Joe Cox murder and the framing of Tommy Mayer. I can say that with some confidence, I think, when you look at the evidence and who Tommy Mayer actually was. The past is full of these events. There is always a patsy. Most recently, Lucy Letby. Don't forget Barry George. He was lucky as his sister campaigned relentlessly. I remember being at a gig with my band at the Metropolitan Sports and Social Club in Bromley. It's called the Warren. And it was for CID officers. One of them came into the dressing room to see if we were all right. And our drummer said, "What's happening with the Dando case?" And this CID officer said, "Well, it was a professional assassination. Her head was held down and she was shot twice in the back of the head. We're looking for somebody from Eastern Europe." That's actually what was said to us. And then, of course, he said that his colleague Hamish was on the case. Now, this Hamish, he got taken off the case, and look what happened. They absolutely framed Barry George. And I remember talking to a lawyer at the time and said that was a miscarriage of justice. And the lawyer turned round and said to me, 12 good men and women found him guilty. That's what you're up against in the law profession. Well, with just a few examples, we can prove many defining events in history to be a fiction. We don't even have to go back as far or as big as the Kennedy assassination. We know that patsies are used, and history tells us so. By defining events, these types of staged terror have given the new system of globalism reasons for major steps forward in keeping us safe, of course, by taking away our freedoms. The big global driver in recent history, of course, was 9/11, the cover story being not only implausible, but also impossible. Long-term history is, of course, much easier to fake. Now, the artefacts which define history are rarely questioned, and of course even more rarely questioned by the dull world of academia and its jobs for life drones, which many of them unfortunately are. The need for mystery has wasted millions of hours of time by obscuring the past and throwing legends and myths around, which are really just a distraction. The very ancient legends are actually more to be trusted than the ones in the past 1,000 years, as they were passed down orally to start with before they were written. When we go back to what the Romans said, we have to take it all on board with a very sceptical mind. But first, going back to Anthony John Hill and his trial at Kingston Crown Court. He was imprisoned for 156 days for attempting to pervert the course of justice at the trial, which was accusing associates of the suicide bombers of 7/7 to be somehow complicit. Mr. Hill, or Muad'Dib as he called himself, that means teacher of righteousness, and it's from the film and novel Dune, made a very interesting argument in court, and I never really understood why this argument was even allowed or accepted to be in the court, because it had nothing to do with the charges that had been brought against him, mainly of perverting the course of justice by sending this DVD to the court. Of course, none of the jury would receive it. It was intercepted by the court management. But he maintained, Mr. Hill, Muad'Dib, that the Crown had no right to try him as Regina Elizabeth, of course Regina summons you, Elizabeth II had not been crowned on Jacob's pillow. Stone of Scone, Stone of Destiny, Leah Fale, as all monarchs, firstly from Scotland until the 13th century, and of course afterwards all British monarchs, had been crowned on top of this stone. Originally by sitting on it, and later it being under the throne, as it allegedly was at the time of Elizabeth's coronation in 1953. Well, it was curious as to why the judge at the Crown Court at Southwark heard Mr. Hill's story in the courtroom with his video evidence, as it had nothing to do with the charge of attempting to pervert the course of justice. The intention of sending his film to the court to be distributed to the jury members, of course, failed, as it would. So it was merely posted to the court and intercepted. I think they wanted to keep him in prison during the time of the trial because of the publicity that he might be able to get. At the opening of the trial, a film of Elizabeth's coronation was shown. There were two camera angles, a long shot and one from the side, which was closer up. Mr. Hill claimed that the stone was not visible and that it had been removed or a fake stone had been put in its place. Well, he had very good reason for saying this, as the stone had indeed been removed in 1950 by 4 Scottish students, and it was allegedly returned 4 months later. Mr. Hill claimed that it had not been there, and therefore Elizabeth was not a legitimate monarch, having not been crowned according to the customs and law of the land. She was not legitimate, therefore she and her court had no jurisdiction over him. I found this argument to be of interest at the time, and I wrote an article about it, and I put it in a magazine. And I'd also been very visible at the court, and I remember being in Wetherspoons at Victoria Station upstairs outside where the platform is. You can see the platform from there and the notice board, and I'd been there all afternoon, and I'd met a couple of friends. One of them had got a train to Penge, and another friend turned up, and then somebody sat down and said, "Oh, hello, Mark. I don't like what you've been saying about the Anthony John Hill case." I said, "Well, it's public. All court cases are public. What don't you like about it?" And he was very threatening, wouldn't leave, and he was trying to imply that he knew a lot about me. We walked off, and my friend just said, "Mark, your life is really weird." We went to a pub, and there was another 2 people who appeared to be planted. No, I'm not paranoid. Well, maybe I am. And they were totally implausible too, and they started asking me the most weird questions. One was meant to be like a market trader character, and the other was like this Iranian hippie. Very, very strange. I think if you like this sort of stuff, do look at our recent show, which is on YouTube, on Odyssey. Please watch it on Odyssey. And it's called Truthers Don't Get Fooled Again. We go into the history of this truth movement and how things were steered. Again, all about creating history. The Irish and Scottish kings and the origins of the Leofeil, however, which one legend says was the pillow which Jacob used, is kind of patchy. If you have seen it, this Leofeil, the Stone of Destiny, the idea of it being used as a pillow is absolutely ridiculous. It's a large block of sandstone, and it's thought to be 400 million years old, which doesn't help much in validating the story. Well, the story we are told to believe is that it is the original stone taken from Scone Abbey by Edward I in 1296. Mr. Hill's argument was, of course, dismissed by the judge, who's a Crown agent, who said, actually, it was quite interesting what he said. He said, "Mr. Hill, I find your story fascinating, but of course I can't possibly agree with it." And it made me wonder why it had been allowed in the first place, because it took up a considerable time. The whole thing took at least half an hour to 40 minutes. So recently, I was thinking of this, and I came across an article in Archaeo News. It really caught my attention, and it said, "The Stone of Destiny's recorded links to Scottish royalty date back almost 100 years, and its origins are shrouded in mystery, with legends linking it to the biblical heroes and ancient Egyptian pharaohs. But now, a new exhibition celebrating the Stone of Destiny has revealed it may originally, wait for it, have been a doorstep." The Stone of Destiny, also known as the Stone of Scone and often referred to in England as the Coronation Stone, is what we're talking about here, of course. The new theory comes after the stone underwent scientific analysis prior to being moved from Edinburgh Castle to its new permanent home at Perth Museum, which opened last month, it says. A recent analysis of the £335 stone found that wear on the top of the historic artefact appears to have been caused by footsteps prior to it being used as the crowning stone of Scotland's monarchs at Scone, near Perth, in medieval times. Alexander III's coronation in 1249 is the first known instance of the Stone of Destiny being used as a crowning ceremony. The story goes that it was covered in gold silk, this cloth which covered its heavily worn surface. Once more, the stepped-upon surface was hidden as Edward Longshanks had it integrated into his throne at Westminster after plundering it from the Scots. In 1996, it was formally brought back to Scotland and put on display alongside other Scottish regalia in Edinburgh's castle's crown room, the Edinburgh Castle. Stone of Destiny left Scotland again, it says here, for a very brief stint, back inside Edward's throne for the coronation, of course, of Charles III. Analysis that, however, carried out in preparation for its transportation to Westminster Abbey for the coronation determined that the stone was quarried from the Scone area, suggesting it may originally have been used in a nearby church or possibly a Roman building. One of the legends about the stone is that it was Jacob's pillow, the stone Jacob laid his head on when he dreamt about the ladder to heaven. Must have been bloody uncomfortable. Unfortunately, there are no surviving origin stories with a plausible kernel of truth that could help explain these scientific discoveries. Dr. Nicky Scott, Senior Cultural Significance Advisor at Historic Environment Scotland, said, "While we know some inauguration rituals did involve the individual being inaugurated to step onto the stone, such as Dunadd Hill Fort, when they were at this Dunadd Hill Fort, that's recorded, the level of wear on the Stone of Destiny doesn't support such use. Even several hundred years of such a ritual wouldn't create the level of wear we see. It's actually really worn down. It's got a big concave centre to it. I mean, it's ridiculous. It looks like something that's been, at one of these ancient monuments for thousands of years, and the wear would still not be as much today as it has on it. It always looks ridiculous. So it says, for the first time, wait a minute, yeah, Professor Dovit Braun, Chair of Scottish History at the University of Glasgow, who contributed to the new interpretation at Perth Museum, said, the evidence is quite compelling. It means that at some point the stone was repurposed as an inaugural throne. So basically, it's more likely that the stone had earlier served as a step. He says, but we don't actually know the context for this, as even several hundred years of such a ritual of being crowned, even if someone stood on it, wouldn't create anything like the level of wear. Well, it wouldn't be worn at all, really, would it have been stepped on several times? So for the first time in 7 centuries, the stone was returned to its ancestral home in Perth following the coronation of Charles III, rather than it being in Edinburgh. It is now in the Perth Museum. The mystery attached to such objects brings people into a web of stories and conspiracies, of course, which I argue here is the precise reason that it is done. In other words, the cover stories, if there's enough of them, will get people arguing amongst themselves, and the real story will just remain hidden. The idea, of course, is to create awe around an object. And it's quite easy. It's simple making up a story, or preferably quite a few, and get the public arguing over them. It's a masterstroke to deflect people away from the matters of real importance, of course. And this, of course, makes it much more difficult to find the real reasons behind the events, because there is a mystery or a good yarn that gets in the way. Well, the Rosicrucians, for instance, are masters of this, and their formation and cover stories have kept writers and historians busy for centuries, whilst, of course, the real goals are being played out, and the organisations behind them, such as the Rosicrucians, are free to carry on with their more practical objectives. There are even modern-day copycat organisations such as AMORC, this new society which was just created in the name of the Rose Cross. And it continues to peddle esoteric stories, sell expensive bric-a-brac, have members, sells rings to their followers, these Rosicrucian AMORC rings. When we're looking at Roman history, also, everything should be viewed with scepticism. And this is something that's come up in our Shattered Isles series. Simply because most of Roman history cannot be authenticated, and the historical banner of the Romans lumps together much later history which appears was not theirs. They also make a lot of stuff up too. So the later manuscripts of the Middle Ages, which are relied upon to explain Roman history, are not in any way to be relied upon. I'm going to have a short break now. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back, dear listener. And just to remind you that if you do want to join our £5 a month club, we do need a few more members to keep going. Do email me at info@windowsontheworld.net, and of course you can still help us out on PayPal and Patreon. All the links are on the home page. Just to reiterate what I was saying at the beginning. Now we're going to get into something very interesting now. It's from unz.com, that's unz.com. The article is called How Fake is Roman Antiquity? And this was posted by one of our Discord members in response to the work we've been doing on Shattered Isles, which of course really does feature Roman history and the replacing of history or the fabricating of history. And in the part of this article, which is about Tacitus and Bracciolini, it says, one of our most detailed historical sources on imperial Rome is Cornelius Tacitus, 56 to 120 CE or BC, whose major works, the Annals and the Histories, span the history of the Roman Empire. Now here is how French scholar Polydore Hoccart introduced in 1890 the result of his investigation on the authenticity of the Annals and the Histories of Tacitus, building up on the work of John Wilson Ross, which had been published 12 years earlier in 1878. To quote it, it says, at the beginning of the 15th century, scholars had at their disposal no part of the works of Tacitus. They were supposed to be lost. It was around 1429 that Poggio Bracciolini and Niccoli of Florence brought to light a manuscript that contained the last 6 books of the Annals and the first 5 books of the Histories. The document is the archetypal reference used today by all historians. Now, when one wants to know where and how it came into their possession, one is surprised to find that they have given unacceptable explanations on the subject, that they either did not want or could not say the truth, it says here. The explanations behind the manuscript and how it came into their possession, however, is not very plausible. In the early 1500s, Pope Leo X was given a volume containing the first 5 books of the Annals. Its origin is also surrounded by mystery. Why should we believe it to be authentic? Poggio and Niccoli were not trusted sources. In actual fact, they did it all for the money. It says we will also notice that Poggio was one of the most learned men of his time, that he was also a clever calligrapher, and that paid scribes had trained him to write on parchment in a remarkable way in Lombard and Caroline characters. Volumes coming out of his hands could thus imitate perfectly the ancient manuscripts. In fact, that is the very conclusion reached in this research article which I'm quoting from. Tracing the origin of the manuscript discovered by Poggio and Niccoli, using Poggio's correspondence as evidence of deception, Hoccart also deals with the emergence of the second manuscript 2 years after Pope Leo X, who was a Medici, had promised a great reward in gold to anyone who could provide him with the unknown manuscripts of the ancient Greeks or Romans. Now there's an incentive, isn't there? Leo rewarded his unknown provider with 500 golden crowns, a fortune at that time, and immediately ordered the printing of the precious manuscripts. Hoccart concludes that the manuscript must have been supplied indirectly to Leo X by Jean-Francois Bracciolini, the son and sole inheritor of Poggio's private library and papers, who happened to be secretary of Pope Leo X at the time, and who used an anonymous intermediary in order to elude suspicion. Both manuscripts are now preserved in Florence, but their age is questionable. Their authenticity is based on a cover story and an assumption. For further works of Tacitus, such as Germania and the Agricola, we don't even have any medieval manuscripts. David Shapps tells us that Germania was ignored throughout the Middle Ages, but survived in a single manuscript that was found in Hersfeld Abbey in 1425. It was brought to Italy and examined by Ennio Silvio Piccolomini, later Pope Pius II, as well as Bracciolini, and then it vanished from sight. Poggio Bracciolini, who lived 1380 to 1459, is credited for rediscovering and recovering a great number of classical Latin manuscripts, mostly decaying and forgotten in German, Swiss and French monastic libraries, and that's actually from Wikipedia, those couple of lines there. Hocart believes that Tacitus' books are not his only forgeries. Under suspicion came other works by Cicero, Lucretius, Vitruvius and Quintilian, to name just a few. Now, we've quoted from Cicero, so this is fascinating, and it really does put everything on a sticky wicket, to say the least. For instance, Lucretius and his only known work, De Rerum Natura, virtually disappeared during the Middle Ages, but was, wait for it, rediscovered in 1417, where? In a monastery in Germany by Poggio Bracciolini. Also was the same with Quintilian's work, a 12-volume textbook on rhetoric entitled Institutio Oratoria. There, amid a tremendous quantity of books, it says, which it would take too long to describe, we found Quintilian still safe and sound, though filthy with mould and dust, for these books were not in the library as befitted their worth, but in a sort of foul and gloomy dungeon at the bottom of one of the towers, where not even men convicted of a capital offence would have been stuck away. Provided Hocart is right, was Poggio the exception that confirms the rule of honesty among the humanists to whom humankind is indebted for rediscovering these great classics, it says? Well, even the great Erasmus, 1465 to 1536, succumbed to the temptation of forging a treatise under the name of Saint Cyprian, and it's called De Duplici Martyrio ad Fortunatum, which he pretended to have found by chance in, of course, an ancient library. Erasmus used this to voice his criticism of the Catholic confusion between virtue and suffering. Well, in this case, he obviously gave himself away. But how many forgeries went undetected for lack of originality? Constable writes in Forgery and Plagiarism in the Middle Ages, the secret of successful forgers and plagiarists is to attune the deceit so closely to the desires and standards of their age that it is not detected or even suspected at the time of the creation. Well, of course, you just play to the audience, you give them what they want to hear, and then, of course, it's part of their history. Job done. In other words, forgeries and plagiarisms follow rather than create fashion, and can without paradox be considered among the most authentic products of their time, of course. We are here focusing on literary forgeries, but there were many other kinds, of course. I mean, Michelangelo himself launched his own career by faking antique statues, including one known as the Sleeping Cupid, which has now been lost. This was while under the employment of the Medici family in Florence, and he used acidic earth to make the statue look antique. It was sold through a dealer to Cardinal Riario of San Giorgio, who eventually found out the hoax and demanded his money back, but he didn't press any charges against the artist. Apart from this recognised forgery, Lynn Catterson has made a strong case that the sculptural group of Laocoon and Sons, dated from around 40 BC and supposedly discovered in 1506 in a vineyard in Rome, and it was immediately acquired by Pope Julius II, is another of Michelangelo's forgeries. So here we have the modern day Roman Church actually making up their own history and creating their own past. Of course, they've always done this. The stories of the saints tell us that. We can look at the story of Rahia in the Smithfield Martyrs. We covered this, how he was actually meant to have seen a vision of St. Bartholomew, but he was on the back of a dragon, which he said was Satan. And this apparition, whatever it was, I reckon if he did have this vision, it was something which was a demon that actually contacted him, because he built a church hospital for the poor where they were going to burn people to death a bit later on, and it was a place of mass human sacrifice on a grand scale, when we look at the history of Smithfield. It's just one example. But it says here that many other antique works raise similar questions. For instance, a comparison between Marcus Aurelius's bronze equestrian statue, previously thought to be of Constantine, with Louis the 16th statue, it was being confused with that. Begs the question why that nothing between the 4th and the 15th centuries is anything like as good. So in other words, you've got an ancient statue and the stuff after it's rubbish. And it doesn't get better for a long time. Can we even be sure, it says, that Marcus Aurelius is a historical figure? Now, of course, he was meant to be a great warrior and a poet. I mean, his poetry is great, but could this just be another story like Shakespeare? It was written by a group of people for the zeitgeist of the times to make the Roman Empire look civilized, which they were very good at doing. They were very good at making themselves look civilized. The major sources, it says, depicting the life and rule of Marcus are patchy and frequently unreliable. The most important one being the highly dubious Historia Augusta. In the mainstream of classical studies, ancient texts are assumed to be authentic if they are not proven to have been forged. Very good point, that, isn't it? This is very relevant to our work, of course, on the relocating of Christianity and the achievements and civilization which is attributed to the Romans, who existed alongside others who were highly advanced, and the Romans simply took or were given the credit. We have to remember that one of their main assets was a high level of administrative achievement. For instance, why would medieval monks copy and preserve these things on expensive parchments? No manuscripts, it says, by pagan authors reached the Renaissance, allegedly older than the 9th century. It says, did the monks, out of pure scientific interest, have a duty to preserve for posterity, for the greater glory of paganism, the masterpieces of antiquity? Asked Hockhart in this publication that we're talking about. In medieval convents, manuscript copying was actually a commercial craft and focused exclusively on religious books such as psalters, gospels, missals, catechisms, and legends of the saints. They were mostly copied on papyrus. Parchment and vellum were reserved for luxury books, and since it was a very expensive material, it was common practice to scrape over the old scrolls of parchment and vellum and just to reuse them. Well, this literally wiped out historical documents for the purpose of reuse of the parchment. Pagan works were the first to disappear. In fact, their destruction rather than their preservation was considered a holy deed by the Holy Roman Empire, as hagiographers abundantly illustrate in the lives of the saints. And if historians meticulously questioned the authenticity of some of our most cherished classical treasures, well, how many of them would actually pass the test? How many would be actually authenticated? Now, propaganda, of course, is nothing new, and the Romans were masters of it, able to rewrite history in an organised and strategic way, not unlike the more easy techniques used in the media at the present time. So history, of course, has literally been rewritten, and often on the same bit of parchment from which the original story originated. So that's like a medieval equivalent of NASA losing the tapes of the moon landings, isn't it? Now, I would recommend you look at that article, and I might do some more on it because it linked into a lot of other things, but it ties in so much with what we've been talking about recently. I thought it'd be a very fascinating addendum to what we're talking about. And of course, it's part of the lifelong learning project, which will go on. So until the next show, do remember to support the show if you can. Check out the archive, and we'll be back very soon on Windows on the World.